right, hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's weekly podcast series. My name is Anaf Kalam, and I will be moderating today's discussion. We are pleased to be joined today by Mr. Josh Hammer, who is a senior editor at Newsweek. He is the host of The Josh Hammer Show, and he is the author, most recently, of Israel and Civilization, The Fate of the Jewish Nation and the Destiny of the West. Now, I was just able to finish this book pretty recently, and I thought it was very well done. So thank you for writing it, Josh. For our audience at home who is watching this in the future, this is a pre-recording session, so please just note that we will not have a interactive Q&A discussion for this broadcast. Now, with that in mind, I want to bring on Mr. Josh Hammer. Thank you for taking the time to join us today.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for all that you and the Middle East Forum do.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I wanted to just kind of get right into it, talking about your book here. And I wanted to start by asking you about something that I first heard you say at the Middle East Forum's policy conference just a few months ago during your keynote address, which was about the influence of Judeo-Christian values and norms in shaping the birth of the United States itself in many senses. You mentioned, for instance, one of the original seals of the U.S. bore the image of Moses crossing the Red Sea. You gave a few other examples. Now, can you tell us more about this historical background of the Judeo-Christian values shaping the Western civilization? Can you tell us why the state of Israel is so important for both understanding this relationship and for defending and preserving it?
Sure. So there's a lot to unpack there, so I'll try to do the best I can. So America was founded as not a neutral country between religion and irreligion, as not a neutral country between theism and atheism. It was really founded as a deeply biblically rooted and in many ways an ecumenical Christian country, but an ecumenical Christian country where the Christian founding fathers really understood that the Hebrew Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament, has a massive, massive role to play in who we are and frankly, what we are. So you correctly alluded to this notion that both Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin famously wanted the national seal of the United States to be Moses crossing the Red Sea and leading the Israelites across. There are too many other anecdotes that we could possibly recite here. There is the notion that going as far back as the Mayflower, Frank, if you want to go back that far, sailing across the Mayflower in 1620, Sir William Bradford, who was the captain of the Mayflower, he actually spoke about 1,000 words of Hebrew because he actually was a student of an English Hebraist by the name of Sir Henry Ainsworth. And there was actually talk on the Mayflower. This never became a thing, but there was some chatter, we now know from the historical record, chatter that resuscitated in the 1780s during the constitutional period, about possibly just ditching the English language, just starting afresh with Hebrew. And this is kind of all in line with Abraham Lincoln's vision, famously alluded to in February 1861, where he refers to Americans as an almost chosen people. Lincoln, by the way, a man of deep Christian faith himself, who quoted the Hebrew Bible over and over and over again in his public speeches. In fact, his second inaugural address, this very short 700-word address that he gave just tragically about a month and a half or so before he was assassinated, considered by rhetoricians, people who study political rhetoric, to be one of the finest pieces of political rhetoric and oration in American history. And it has these famous, moving, stirring closing words about how with malice for none and with charity for all, let us bind up the nation's wounds. And this speech has a reference to Hebrew scripture in virtually every other sentence, including that famous line about binding up the nation's wounds, which is just a reference to Psalms chapter 147, which is essentially a verbatim quote. So everywhere you look, this is really part of who you are. And anyone who's been to Philadelphia has seen that the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia is inscribed not with pagan sources such as Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Rather, the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia has Leviticus chapter 25. Thou shalt proclaim liberty throughout the land and to all the inhabitants thereof. So it was not even a debate that this story of the Israelites fleeing oppression in Pharaoh's Egypt and seeking freedom in the Promised Land, that this is a story that resonated with the Pilgrims on the Mayflower, it resonated with the Founding Fathers, it resonated with Lincoln. It has always resonated with Americans going back all the way to the nation's origin. So in the book Israel and Civilization, I essentially start on October 7th, and I look at the world's reaction to October 7th, this morally confused reaction. And to me, I see a civilization that is adrift, that is at something of an inflection point, and is at serious risk unless it recovers a sense of its purpose and what it is and what it can and ought to be. That is at risk of being subjugated by various hegemonic subjugationist forces. In the book, I identify at least three. I call them wokeism, global neoliberalism, and Islamism, probably the easiest to define of all those. But we can kind of get into what each of these specifically entails, but I guess for now I'll just say that the point is that if Western civilization is going to ward off these forces, you have to understand what you actually are, because only a people that understands what it is has any chance of having the confidence to withstand forces that very much want to kill you. And I argue in the book repeatedly that when we refer to the West and the United States being a shining beacon, this city on the hill type edifice, by the way, the hill in the phraseology city on the hill is referring to Jerusalem. It's not referring to any other city but Jerusalem. But this entire notion of America being the city on the hill is ultimately rooted in Scripture. And I guess I would just briefly say, because there's a lot in your questions here, but when it comes to the contemporary capital S state of Israel, it seems to me that the capital S state of Israel is the canary in the coal mine when it comes to literally all three of those subjugationist forces. So they are the canary in the coal mine when it comes to wokeism, when it comes to the modern identitarian, identity politics, DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, addle-brained left. The Jews and the Jewish state are very much the canary in the coal mine there. They are, by definition, the canary in the coal mine when it comes to Islamism. I think that point goes without need of any further explanation. And the Jewish state is also the canary in the coal mine when it comes to what I refer to as global neoliberalism, as this homogenizing force that we can root in the United Nations, the World Economic Forum, that ultimately seeks to eradicate nothing less than, if we're being candid, the nation state itself. And to me, there's actually, and I'll end with this, there's actually a real reason for that as well, which is why the globalists, for lack of a better term, tend to focus on the very particularist and nationalist Jewish state, which is, one, Israel is a very nationalist enterprise, and there's conscription, military, and all of that. But the deeper reason why I think a lot of them feel a need to start with Israel is because Israel is actually, in many ways, the world's first example of what we might refer to as a nation state. When King David unites the tribes of Jerusalem thousands of years ago, that is an act of uniting tribes with similar customs and language and background into a concrete nation with defined, discernible borders, defined in that particular case by no one less than God himself. So if you care about the nation state, you have a particular reason to care about the capital state of Israel as well. But all of this is, again, to take it back to America, is just deeply ingrained in who we are. And I think that if America, I mean, even holding for now Israel aside, just if America wants to be America, we have to recover a sense of who we are. Only that will make us great again.
Thank you. Now, you describe the West as not an either or, but a combination of revelation and reason. And you also name, of course, the three big threats, as you just stated: Islamism, wokeism, and the neoliberal threat. This combination of revelation and reason, do you think this is the only weapon we have to fight against these three threats, or do you think it could be done independently in a society that values either reason or one that values just revelation?
I think you'd have a better chance of a society that is just with revelation. I think that it would be a massive mistake to just try to stick with a contextual, values neutral reason without any sense of tethering. So you're right. The traditional formulation of Western civilization is this amalgamation of Greco-Roman reason with revelation, Athens and Jerusalem, as the formulation often goes. This is certainly the definition given to us by the 20th century University of Chicago political scientist Leo Strauss. But in the book, I make a somewhat provocative claim, or at least countercultural for today's day and age in the year 2025, which is that if you're really going to be honest here and say that one of these is actually more important, and not just more important, but really more defines and encapsulates who we actually are, I would argue it's revelation. I think that the Bible and the Judeo-Christian heritage, it really encapsulates who we are, because I define Western civilization as actually beginning with the giving of God's word, with God's original revelation to Moses and the Israelites there at Mount Sinai. That everything that we take for granted today is ultimately downstream of that. I mean, there's too many examples to name. Just to give a couple of higher profile ones, you have nothing less than the golden rule of societal relations. This notion that I learned once upon a time in kindergarten, that you should do unto others as you would like to be done to yourself. They don't really tell you where that comes from, at least in the public school where I went as a kindergartner. That's coming from Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18, this notion that you shall treat a stranger as your fellow. I mean, this is a biblical antecedent of the modern golden rule, one of the glues that holds civil society together. Similarly, I argue in the book that Genesis 1:27, the divine image imperative, we would say B'Tselem Elohim in Hebrew, this notion that man is made in God's image, male and female, he created them. This is the single most important ethical imperative for all of Western civilization. I mean, we were just speaking about the founding fathers. Thomas Jefferson, writing in 1776, the Declaration of Independence, talking about, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Well, he wasn't writing that in a vacuum. You know, John Locke, a century prior, was not writing very similar things in a vacuum. They were writing this in a certain context, in a certain milieu, and that milieu is the biblical heritage, the Judeo-Christian heritage, Western civilization at large. So many of the things that hold us together today ultimately really do come from this. So I do think that if you're going to put a thumb on the scale, the thumb on the scale, contrary to what a lot of modern culture would say, really ought to be on the scale of revelation. Now, reason has a place, to be sure, but I think that reason unmoored from revelation can go off the rails really, really quickly. To just give a very provocative example, you know, Weimar-era Germany into Nazi-era Germany really thought that they were acting quite reasonably. In fact, they had fancy academic terms for much of what they were doing here. Lebensraum, if I have the German correctly, was essentially their theory as to how to be compassionate when it came to people that were inferior races of the Aryans. Well, you know, in this particular context, that Nazi era German reason ends up culminating in the train tracks leading to Auschwitz and Treblinka. So reason unmoored from certain anchoring principles can go off the rails really, really, really quickly. So there is a role for reason, but only contextualized within a certain exogenous framework.
Thank you. Now, your position, Israel as a battleground in a civilization clash between the West and the forces of Islamist barbarism, as well as the woke ideology, more common in the West. You reference at some point George Gilder's Israel test, and suggests that support for Israel is a litmus test for supporting the West. Can you go more into detail on that?
Yeah, look, it seems to me that if you understand what Western civilization is properly defined, then you really ought to be a supporter of not just the capitalist state of Israel, but also the children of Israel, the Jewish people, because you ought to understand that it really is the Bible that made the West, and it is the Bible that made the West great in the first place. In the same way that you cannot discard the original recipients of the word of God, the Jewish people, so can you not necessarily just discard the canary in the coal mine, the place where this great story that is the Bible actually happened, the state of Israel. So where you come down on whether you support Israel, to me, is a proxy in many ways for support for the United States, for the West. And to kind of preview where I think you're probably going with the next few questions, you know, it's not an accident that a lot of these figures on the so-called right, people like Tucker Carlson, you know, it is not an accident that folks who fail what George Gilder would refer to as the Israel test oftentimes don't necessarily seem to be huge fans even of Western civilization itself. I mean, you know, Tucker recently giving a friendly interview, shall we say, to the president of Iran, the Ayatollah Khamenei's puppet. You know, that is not necessarily something that is easy to reconcile with someone who is a fan of Western civilization. So it's no surprise that someone like that fails what George Gilder would refer to as the Israel test.
Yeah. It's, nothing says America first, like not pushing back on a single thing that that Pezeshkian said in that interview, or having that interview alone for that matter. But yes, just a couple of days ago, you participated in a debate on Israel against Dave Smith at the Turning Point USA conference. And I watched that. I just finished it earlier this morning, and I think you did fantastic. And now there's a lot of mixed responses on the outcome of that debate, but Being there in person, did you feel that they were more receptive to your arguments about Israel, or did you sense that they were more sympathetic to Dave Smith and kind of the woke right arguments, just by kind of reading the room?
Yeah, the crowd was definitely mixed. Look, I mean, we definitely both had our applause lines. I will say that Dave Smith was the only one who was booed. He was booed at least twice, once during my opening remarks, and once when he had the utterly poor judgment to accuse people of not being able to credibly call themselves pro-life if they supported Israel's war. That was a massive unforced error to a largely pro-life Christian audience, and he was properly booed for saying that. But he definitely had his supporters. My sense, so Turning Point USA is a good proxy for kind of younger conservatives, right? For millennial and Gen Z conservatives. Charlie Kirk, that has built an amazing organization for sure. Charlie's a friend on a personal level, so he gets a lot of credit for that. And my general sense as to Gen Z millennial conservatives, including the folks who are there at Turning Point USA, is that you're looking at a lot of folks, especially activists who come to conferences like this, who are oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes religious, oftentimes Christians, and oftentimes do have a natural sense of affinity for Israel, for the Jewish people, for the Holy Land, the holy sites. But on the other side of the spectrum, they grew up in the aftermath and in the fallout of America's generally failed efforts in wars such as Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya and so forth. So they have this kind of interesting mix of opinions where they have like a natural instinctual affinity for the Jews and or the Jewish state. Again, not always, but like this is a general sentiment, right? And on the other hand, they have a general deep skepticism bordering at times on disdain of America getting too involved in foreign affairs. So part of my job as someone who is, a millennial myself, as someone who is a proud Jew, proud Zionist, but also a card-carrying Trump voter, a conservative. I mean, my conservative bona fides are not really in doubt here. So part of my job on that debate stage is to make the case for an audience like this as to how you actually can support U.S.-Israel relations. You can have a very similar foreign policy to, frankly, the commander-in-chief, the President Donald Trump himself in this case there, and not go down the rabbit hole of the Tucker Carlson, Dave Smith, lunatic, libertarian isolationism, utopian ideology there. So the crowd itself was definitely mixed, but I will say this, that I felt like I achieved what was my number one aim in this debate, which was to drive an unmistakable wedge between the ideological libertarianism and isolationism of the Tucker Carlson, Dave Smith wing and the Trump doctrine, because certainly the way that these folks think of quote unquote America first is very, very, very different than how the commander-in-chief, President Trump, thinks of that same very term.
Absolutely. Now, speaking of this question of foreign influence and this disdain for any foreign involvement in any way, shape, or form, something that was brought up during the debate, you brought this up, and I'm very glad you did, was the double standard when it comes to so-called foreign agents operating inside the United States. And of course, Dave Smith brought up AIPAC as he does, as though there's some sort of shadowy, omnipotent international body of evil. And you and I might say that he's giving them a bit too much credit, but then you rightfully brought up groups like NIAC, the National Iranian American Council, which it's really no secret now operates as the arm of the Islamic Republic inside the United States. And you could have gone on at length too, right? You have CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, the Muslim Brotherhood. You've got ICNA, which is a South Asian front for Jamaat Islami here in the U.S., and the list is, exhaustive. Dave Smith kind of conceded and said, yeah, sure, I condemn CARE as well if they're a foreign agent. But then he just sort of brushes it off as though it's nothing, as though they have no real meaningful or harmful influence or any of those similar groups inside the United States, while it's just the Israeli or the pro-Israeli, pro-Zionist lobbies that have all the influence. What do you think explains that blind spot, we'll say?
Yeah, blind spot is probably a little charitable, right? Look, the problem with people like Dave Smith, I mean, let's just be very candid here for a second. I mean, Dave Smith is a D-list comedian who is now moonlighting as a single-issue political commentator saying offensively stupid things. I mean, this is not necessarily someone who has done the reading, who frankly cares, who is intellectually curious to actually read and to learn. And I say all that because I think facts are somewhat impervious to the way that a lot of these people think and talk about the world. I think one of the more interesting exchanges in our debate was when we kind of got on this back and forth about how stupid the World War III catastrophists now look, about how they warned about thousands of dead Americans and China and Russia swooping in. And he was like, "Don't blame me. I was just warning like what could come wrong." And my response is no. Like the fact that you were so wrong and so easily anyone could see this. I mean, anyone who knows anything about how China and Russia operate at this current moment, with Russia bogged down in Ukraine, with China preoccupied with all their own problems, the real estate market at home and whatnot there, anyone could have easily seen that there was no world in which the BRICS alliance, as Tucker once said, would come swooping to the aid of Iran. This is actually a very easily foreseeable thing for anyone who knows, how the world works. I mean, how these alliances work, the relative value or lack thereof of the Iranian regime in that particular axis, and so forth there. So that was my base response, is that no, you weren't just warning what could have happened there. You actually just said dumb things, and you frankly just look stupid, and no one should take you seriously. So that was kind of my point on that. But look, to your specific point about why a lot of these people harp on about the pro-Israel lobby, if you want to get really anti-Semitic, the Jewish lobby. I mean, first of all, the notion that there is a unified Jewish lobby can be easily disproved by one data point alone, which is the fact that Dave Smith and I had a debate, right? I mean, Dave Smith loves reminding people that he's a Jew, allegedly. I mean, I don't know. I've never bothered to ask for the halachic like Jewish legal certification of that, whatever. To be clear, not that we have cards that prove that, but some people have their doubts, let's say. But regardless, I mean, he calls himself a Jew. He loves identifying as Jew. So the fact that Dave Smith and I had a debate on stage, literally itself disproves the existence of a monolithic, unified, quote-unquote Jewish lobby, as does the existence of J Street and so-called Jewish Voice for Peace and If Not Now and all these stupid, rabidly far left, idiotic groups there. So there obviously is no such thing. But for folks who are coming at this, again, not from a place of facts and empiricism and not trying to actually observe what's happening and to conclude things based on your observations and to try to have an informed opinion, for folks who are coming not from that starting point, but are coming from a starting point of ideology, for ideological reasons, they have to make there out to be a nefarious Israel lobby there, because that then in turn will then try to kind of get what they actually want, which is an America, head in the sand like an ostrich style ultra-isolationist foreign policy. That's where this is coming from. It's coming from ideological reasons. For someone who is allegedly Jewish like Dave Smith, maybe it's coming from some sort of deep resentment, psychological reasons. Maybe his mother dropped him on his head as a child. I don't know. I'm not a shrink. I don't really need to get into details there. The guy's a hot mess. But I mean, that's frankly part of what I expect is going on here, is it's just coming from a place of just ideology and not facts.
And speaking of not facts, one thing, even when you present these facts very clearly to Dave Smith, especially in this debate here, I thought you did a very good job of bringing up actual facts. When one of his other taglines is that people always do this; they attack me and not the argument. And what do? You come up with actual facts. At one point, you mentioned, and I think this is a crucial fact that doesn't get mentioned enough. It's the figure from John Spencer at West Point, who we had on our show as well. And the ratio of civilian to combatant casualties, which I think was about 1.5 civilians for every combatant in Gaza, exactly, which even dwarfs the already impressively low ratio of Americans in Mosul, which was about 2.5 civilians for every combatant. And, you brought that up, and Dave Smith hears that figure and he kind of just says, yeah, okay, whatever. And then he continues to keep calling it a genocide and say things like Israel is targeting infants and children and indiscriminately conducting operations. It is just so strange to watch in real time that just facts don't seem to matter when they're thrown at you and put in front of your face.
This happened to us. So Smith and I debated back in February as well. This is actually our second go-around. We debated at Princeton in New Jersey back in February as part of a Steamboat Institute Campus Liberty Tour debate. And something very similar happened then. He was accusing Israel of slaughtering children and genocide. And, I'm a lawyer background. I know a thing or two about the actual legal definition of genocide. So I actually started citing Geneva, article this, here's the actual definition of genocide. And I said that on stage at Princeton back in February, and Smith basically responds, if memory serves, and he says, yeah, but look at all the rubble. Literally, like look at the rubble. I mean, like how at a certain level, how do you argue with that, right?
Yeah,
It's
you
very
can't bring
difficult.
up
You
when
can't,
the
and that's actually why, by the way, I've got a mixed reaction to my opening statement, where among other things, I took out the sheet of paper and read some of Dave Smith's tweets calling President Trump a war criminal, whatever. If we lived in if we lived in a day and age where the only thing that mattered was facts and logic and history and law, I would never feel the need to do that. But here's the point: we don't. We actually don't. You actually have to appeal to people's emotions, and this is a very, very MAGA pro-Trump venue. I consider myself part of MAGA as well. I voted for Trump numerous times and so forth there. So this was actually the right venue, with no less than Charlie Kirk as the moderator of this debate, to try to drive home this point that what Smith and by extension Tucker and others are arguing is actually, not only is it wildly inconsistent with the Trump doctrine of foreign policy, but it is so offensive to a libertarian propagandist like Smith that he actually thinks Trump is a war criminal who should rot in jail. So that was actually the point that I was getting at there, was that, but again, like if we lived in like a nice kind of 19th century style Oxford debate where everyone was kind of pontificating and reasoning, there would be no need for this kind of pulling at the heartstrings there. But that frankly is why I think that was necessary, and I think ultimately somewhat effective.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even today, you're not going to get that sort of debate, even in the Oxford Union.
That's right.
You could, you could have said, you could have been on and on. You can make your case and state it with vigor and compassion, and then they hold up a picture of a dead baby, and they're like, "Oh, what about this?" And that's all there is. You've lost. You're the guy who's pro dead babies, and that's all they understand. Um, Now, I sense we are running out of time here for this podcast, but before we go, I want to ask, apart from your new book that was just released, is there somewhere where you might direct our viewers and listeners if they would like to follow more of your work?
Yeah, sure. So, of course, thank you very much for having me. So, again, one final time, the book is Israel and Civilization: The Fate of the Jewish Nation and the Destiny of the West. I have a show, The Josh Hammer Show, which is available everywhere podcasts are available, Apple, Spotify, and so forth. So go ahead and check out The Josh Hammer Show. I write a weekly syndicated opinion column that goes up at Newsweek, where I'm senior editor at large, and the Los Angeles Times, Real Clear Politics, plenty of other places as well. And then I'm also on X at Josh_Hammer, Instagram at Josh B. Hammer as well.
All right, many thanks, and thank you again for taking the time to share your insights, talk about your book, and discuss that debate.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Yeah, of course. For our viewers and listeners, please be on the lookout in your email inboxes over the weekend for next week's upcoming podcast offerings. As always, I thank you all again for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Thanks.